Hello and welcome to the Australian Institute of Insider Threat. Hi, I'm Boz Fisher and I'm thrilled you're here today as we have a very special guest. Pierre Skorich is not just an acclaimed author, but also a thought leader in the field of insider risk. He's a co-author of this amazing book called Insider Threat, A Systematic Approach, along with Matthew Manning. And we're going to actually bring this book to life. He's going to give us some of his thoughts, ideas, his process of how he came across this book. So if you're a chief information security officer, an insider risk steward, or just a scholar, you're in for a treat. So come and join me and let's get started. Before we get going, Pierre, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to it. Can you give us and the viewers sort of a bit of your background and your role of who you are and so forth?
Yeah, no worries. Well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. I guess to tell you about my background, I've chiefly worked in the federal government, but across a whole range of different fields, from policy making, very strong background in law enforcement, national security, and regulatory organisations. And that's how I came to take an interest in insider threat, was primarily through working with big regulatory organisations and occupying in a couple of organisations those functions. And I've also worked very closely with the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre in the Attorney General's Department as well. So kind of a broad base, and have a very strong interest, I guess, in risk governance and kind of organisational systems.
Excellent, excellent. Well, before we start with the questions, I just wanted to give you sort of my own perspective of the book. I very much enjoyed it. I'm sort of a type of person that when I take a book, I sort of highlight, I read a few pages and I said, okay, I've got to think about it. It's got to steer my mind. And so I end up, putting heaps of notes, wrote it, caption and so forth. So very much enjoyed the book. It had some great nuances and so forth like that. So let me start by asking you, what inspired you to write about it?
Yeah. There's probably a few things. Like I said, I came from a regulatory background. One of the things that I did a long time ago was being involved in the setup of the Clean Energy Regulator.
Yeah.
And I was in charge of basically setting up the operating model for the organisation, which was all about a very structured approach to understanding the regulatory risk and deploying our resources and assets to that regulatory risk. And then I came into another organisation to basically take over the insider risk, internal fraud sort of functions. And I guess what I found looking at it and comparing the kind of work that I'd done before was that there isn't a lot of maturity, or there hadn't been a lot of maturity in dealing with insider risk really in organisations anywhere that I'd really seen. A lot of things focused very much on kind of the events of the risk. So you end up with, spreadsheets with big long lists of risks in them. Yep. There was also a lot of focus, I guess, in the narrative about, bad people and how you stop bad people from doing bad things and that sort of stuff. So it was very people-centric. And there was a lot of focus also, I guess, on reporting mechanisms and tip-offs. And like immediately I'm looking at...
Yeah, you see that a lot.
Tip-offs, like they're an important part of a system, but they are also like prone to a lot of issues. And one of the case studies from that particular organization was exactly where tip-offs really had not worked, because people were in a kind of a network of insider threat working together. Other people sort of saw things, but they didn't really recognize what they were seeing. So effectively that whole process failed in a very, very major way. So it was a real stark example of that not being the strongest way of really dealing with insider threat. And using some of that background to that organization, I developed a framework which eventually became what the book is about, which is I looked through all of the functions of that organization and really spent a lot of time actually watching what happened. So like in different functions within the organization, observing how it was done, who was involved, what sort of checks and balances were in place and that sort of thing. And from that, put together a structured framework for understanding risk within that organizational context. And then the last bit of the story really is I came to work with Matt Manning on a very different body of work, really. It was about, we started doing some thinking about a anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing harm index.
Oh, wow.
Through that, we had conversations about, this framework, and he is one of the top academics in the crime science field. And he had a look at some of this stuff and said, there's really nothing like this out there, and it should be put into a book so other people can use that knowledge. That's what we said about doing.
No, I was very much curious to see what's the collaboration that you had with Matthew Manning. So you sort of preempted me. That's great. You mentioned in the book a sort of a new framework for understanding insider risk by focus on organization systems. How does the systematic approach differ from traditional methods of addressing insider threats?
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at that. One of them I might start with the easy one, which I think is there's a lot of focus in organizations from my perspective on the enforcement end of things. So it's very much about, the tip off and then dealing with the people. So those people need to go through code of conduct investigations, or they'll need to do through criminal investigations and that sort of thing. But that's dealing with the problem after it's occurred.
Correct.
So it has no prevention element to it really, other than a kind of a tenuous relationship to deterrence, which we kind of know, unless there's a very strong detection mechanisms, deterrence doesn't necessarily have a very strong impact. So that's, I guess, one thing. The other side is how risk is assessed. So I sort of touched on this before. I've been in multiple organizations, and it's across the risk field, right? There's a lot of focus on what's the risk event. And that means you come up with big, long lists of different types of events. Someone could, defraud their credit card. They could do this, they could do that. And so it comes up with a big, long list of sort of things. And often those things are not necessarily the most critical ones, but they're the ones that you can recall the easiest. Yeah. So I think what I use the credit card example in part because that's one that I often hear. And I think, well, but credit cards, it's a really important, right? And your financial management is an important thing, but it's not actually critical. It's not your business success, right?
Yes.
Particularly when you're thinking in a government kind of context, you have a mission that you're set up to, and the credit card is a part of that. It's an input, but it's not the mission itself. And so you're not necessarily focusing on the things that are going to create the greatest harm. So as a result, the thing that changes, I think, from my perspective, is looking at it through the lens of the organization design. What are the mission that you're trying to achieve? How does insider threat therefore impact on that mission and objective? What are therefore the assets that contribute most to that thing, and how are they exposed? And what it suggests is that you should understand the architecture of the organization, and then suggest that you've got basically three kinds of assets that organizations have that contribute to that. And people is kind of a one, but in terms of insider threat, it's really about the decisions that people are able to make within the organization, the tangible and intangible types of assets, the things that we actually use to do things, whether it's computers or whatever, X-ray machines, and the information that you hold in order to enable those things. And they become effectively the center of a model. And what that really is doing then is saying, let's not think about the risk event, let's think about the drivers. And the other, so those are the kind of the targets, but then it's also understanding, well, what provides the opportunity for a person to actually, follow through with an insider threat, whether it's like deliberate or inadvertent. What are the motivations for it? Who's actually benefiting from it if there's an external entity that's involved in it, and how do they play in that field? So sometimes location is an important element as well, insofar as you've got, different things happen differently in different places.
Correct.
And I guess then there's the other elements of it too that So that's just about the risk assessment process. But you've got other elements that are part of controlling the risk. And I think culture plays a really important part.
Sure does.
Obviously, the risk controls play an important part. Assuring those controls plays a really important part as well. So you can't just sort of say, again, this is something that I saw in risk assessment. They're written down on paper, but do you have confidence that they're really there? Do you have confidence that they're working?
Right. Yeah, no, that is so true, so true. You mentioned in the book about other approaches to insider risk in terms of interventionism, managerialism, organization integrity. What are your thoughts in terms of those approaches compared to what you've written in the book? Or your thinking?
Yeah, so the interventionism kind of model really was almost what I was touching on before. It's very focused on those kind of punishments and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The organizational integrity model is interesting, I think, insofar as like what it's about is promoting, I guess, a sound and integrity-based culture for an organization that's reflected through its systems of management.
Yeah.
Which I think is a really important component. I think one of the issues with the kind of the previous view of those is that they're seen as mutually exclusive, like you can't have all of those things together. To me, a managerialist model is about governance and the putting in place of those mechanisms of control. And you do that in part through creating culture. You do it in part through those kind of physical and system kind of controls. And you do need to have things that respond to incidents, including ways of dealing with people who have gone and done the wrong thing. So seeing them as exclusive from one another, I think, is a weakness in some of those models. It's actually part of, again, a system that should come together.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of an overview of how you came across the idea of developing a sort of a systematic approach. But why is that important?
I think probably the crux of why it's so important is because organizations have finite resources to invest in anything that they do. So if you're systematic or systemic in the way that you assess risk, you're going to equally be unsystematic and unsystemic in the way that you deploy those resources to fix them.
Correct.
And you're never going to be able to put it in the right places, and therefore some of those very big things that can really significantly impact on your organizational objectives might be left totally exposed while you're dealing with these things that are effectively kind of rats and mice. And that's kind of what I've seen in reality, is that those resources don't necessarily go to the critical things. Then the organization gets caught by surprise by something that it thought was not a problem because it hadn't seen it before, right? But just because you haven't seen something before doesn't mean it's not possible. And so having a systematic approach is really about understanding risk really well, and therefore understanding how you deploy your assets and resources to deal with that in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Yeah, you mentioned quite a bit about the complexity of organizations and so forth. How does a systematic approach deal with, well, every organization is unique, so they'll have their own unique problems and challenges, but I'm sort of interested to hear your thoughts about how does a sort of a systematic approach look at complexity?
Yeah.
And dynamics of an organization as such.
Yeah. I guess that, again, there's kind of, it sounds very dualist, but organizations are complex and different, but in many ways they're also very much the same. So again, like for me, having worked in so many of them, you see that actually the regulatory systems that we employ are actually very much the same thing. Like quite often what we're trying to do is we're controlling the entry into a market, we're controlling how someone behaves in that market, and then how they exit from that market. So And we do that through things like registering people. We get them to report on things. We get them to, they have to report correctly. We give them some benefit or we take something away from them. And all of those things are very similar. We have powers that allow us to do that. So whether it's about the power to collect information, the power to apply penalties, all of those sorts of things. So they're actually very similar in that way. And that's, I think, looking at them in a systemic and organizational design way helps you to identify what those elements and similarities are and have a structured way of kind of working your mind through that complexity.
Correct.
You've got a model to think about it. And I think that I forgot the end of what I was going to say then. Can you
I'm talking about from a perspective of the complexity nature of an organization. Because
I think
it's funny because when I sort of speak to organizations, they usually don't know where to start, number one. All right. So because they've got so many moving objects, and the thinking is, where do I start and how do I solve it?
Yeah.
And
So what I was going to say was, I think the classification of, if you can't, I did this talk about this a long time ago, which was about if you can't classify what you can't describe, you can't manage, right? But if you've got a classification system for things, then you can describe what they are and you can describe how they link to one another. And there's one chapter at the end of the book which I really dedicate to trying to put all the elements together again. So it's like most of it goes through what are all of these pieces that make up this problem, but then at the end it's how do all of those elements of things fit together? Like, opportunity is a thing that attaches both to the assets that you've got and to the roles. So it's the people that have those opportunities based upon what powers that they have within the organization and things like that. And that systematic approach, I think, helps you to, again, understand the problem in a much more deconstructed way. Like, it allows you to understand what those different elements are and to think about them consistently all the way through the risk assessment process. I think the other thing that it does is it also helps you to think about controls in a really structured way. So again, in the book, I've given a catalogue of controls. The way that that catalogue kind of emerged was thinking about, well, if these are all of the elements of the risk, well, why don't we just think about, well, what effect do we need to have on those things? Like, we need to have an effect on opportunity. So we need to, have things that prevent opportunity. We need to have things that detect where that opportunity has arisen, and then we need to have things that respond to the incidents if they arise. And having that effect-based kind of thinking about control also helps you to identify what is it that you're trying to control and how do you control that thing.
Yeah. I very much like an excerpt in the book, and let me read it out. You said, managing insider risk cannot just be a frivolous exercise for interest's sake, but should result in measurably better outcomes than a system which does not protect itself from threat. I think it's really important, but I'd love to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah. I guess the underlying premise there is really that if you're going to invest in putting a system in place, it should work, right? Like, it's as simple as that. You don't want to be, as an organization and as the CEO of that organization or whatever the managing body of it is, investing money in something that doesn't make the world and your organization a better place and reduce the harms that might otherwise occur. So making sure that it's not just an exercise of sort of ticking boxes or undergoing the process because something else tells you that you should do that. It really is it's part of the protecting the objectives of your organization. And I think from the kind of senior management perspective, it's really part of meeting the obligations of risk management to the organization that help you fulfill the role that you have.
Very much so. Look, I've seen very much ticking the box when it comes to compliance, and that doesn't mean it's secure. It's just
no. And it's important because it's about the organization's success, right? So
totally. Yep. Correct.
It's not sort of like, again, if we think about it through the bad people lens, then it's only about sort of dealing with those things. Whereas when we're thinking about it as actually integral to treating risks that can affect the organization achieving its objectives, it becomes much more significant in your mind about how that needs to fit within the organization's risk frameworks.
Very true, very true. How has your perspective evolved throughout your research and routing over this period? How long did it take you to write the book?
It was I suppose it's been a long time coming in my head. It probably took me about 12 months, but it was over weekends. I was part of the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and my weekends were all taken up trying to write everything down. But like in terms of the thinking processes, it's been much longer than that.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of evolution, there's probably a few nuances in there that I've come to over time, particularly while I was writing them. But overall, I would say the experiences both of writing, researching, and then looking at things in an organization has probably reinforced my view that a systemic approach is the way to make things better. Because I've looking at case studies while I was writing the book, I'm like, well, I can identify all the elements of this case and how that might have been better assessed and better managed before it occurred. Because here you can see the element of who was, who committed this thing. You can see the elements of what opportunity they took advantage of to do that.
Yep.
You can see the element of, who was benefiting and how they became involved and how they, sometimes groomed people. And so all the elements kind of made sense. I did, there's a chapter there which talks briefly about CCTV and active and passive CCTV as a control. Again, like there's a chapter that's kind of dedicated to thinking about the effectiveness of controls and the types of things that we do to assure them and stuff. Reading that CCTV bit and thinking about, what's the threshold at which someone looking at screens is going to be able to assess what's going on, and when do we go past that? That simple example of we really need to think about these controls, because just thinking you've got CCTV, you're okay, is not the same thing as understanding like how far you can push the bounds of that as a control and having a strong understanding of them. So all of those things kind of reinforce my view that actually that there is something really, I hope that helps organizations to think better about this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. What role do you think of human behavior and psychology play in the systematic approach, and how do you incorporate these aspects into your framework?
Yeah. So there's a few different ways. One of them is in the risk assessment process. I talk a reasonable amount about the role of heuristics in the way that, again, non-systemic type risk assessments often play out. So things like confirmation bias, we see this thing, so we think that's the way that the world works, and like we've got a preconceived view, and so we want to fit that into things. Differs very much from a kind of a more scientifically based approach. So heuristics play a very big role if we're not careful in making risk assessments less effective than they could be. So that psychological, input to the way that we assess things as humans, I think is an important component that I talk about. I've sort of touched a bit on motivation. So there's parts dedicated to thinking about the motivation and very much drawing on, the traditional fraud triangle, pressure, rationalization, but also adding to it the inducement element, which is, to me, is the bit that's like the actual physical bribe or the threat or whatever it is that actually provides the catalyst at that point in time for things. So it's also an important element, because we can't, even though I say, we need to think about it through an organizational system lens, people are part of that system. So you need to understand them just as much. You just need to understand that they're not as systemic as all the other parts, right? People get motivated by entirely different things because we are very different to it.
That's true. Yep.
And then the other part, I think, is, we touched on the culture element, and we need to think about that both in terms of understanding how current cultures within an organization from a diagnostic perspective, can contribute to insider threat, and also from that perspective, then how do we improve the culture towards integrity, towards reducing things like rationalization and so on. Like if people are unhappy within the organization because they aren't treated well, because the culture's not good, that has I think a contributing factor to insider threat. So we need to think about those cultural elements as well.
Yeah, very much. So in your thinking, how do you address or approach and sort of an insider's dual nature as being an asset and also being a potential risk to an organization? It's a bit like the yin and yang, isn't it, in some ways?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've often said is like really having a strong insider risk system is about protecting your people. So
yeah,
I think a lot of the time there's this kind of premise that someone, you see the case studies and here's someone who has, done something, they've facilitated, some terrible activity, or they've stolen information, or they've been responsible for sabotaging an organization, or whatever it might be. And I think the premise is often that they are just an inherently bad person.
Yeah, yep.
But the reality is that they have come from somewhere and they've ended up there. And there's often, I think, it's that saying about there, but for the grace of God or whatever, that there go I. There are, people who, and again, there are case studies on this, who are just like everyone else. They've come into an organization, they wanted to do their best work, and something's happened, and they just happen to have been exposed to the wrong people when they were at a point of vulnerability, and they've been groomed or whatever, and so they end up being compromised at that point in time. So we've almost let them down if we let them get to that point, because otherwise perhaps they would have been a great employee if we'd had the right kind of layers of protection around them. So I think we do need to treat them as if they're, their asset to the organisation as an employee, and put layers of control around them, but recognise that they are also the actor in the system as well.
Yeah, very much so. No, I'm very glad you mentioned that. Actually, what I want is, can you elaborate between the idea of proactive prevention compared to reactive response? I mean, there's a lot of talk, and I understand both are important, but I just want to sort of hear from your perspective.
Yeah, I think the balance from my perspective is, generally speaking, prevention works at a population level while reaction works at an incident level. So if you think about it from an investment perspective, you've got an amount of investment that you put into dealing with problems at large, or you can deal with a series of incidents, each one of which you've got to invest individually to manage. So from that perspective, like, it's inherent that I think that prevention plays a very, it needs to play a stronger role from organisation perspective. The other thing I think is, often the harm can have occurred by the time you get to your reaction space, depending on how quickly you're able to detect and react. But so in some ways, it hasn't actually solved your problem. It might solve the next one.
Correct.
But sometimes that if you also don't have a link between your reaction and your finding of whatever it is that you've found, and then creating prevention for the future incident. And often I see that you've done the work to investigate someone and to prosecute them, or whatever it is, or you've just, you fired them, but the next person who occupies exactly the same role is in exactly the same position. So you've not actually solved the problem, really. You've just dealt with the incident.
Correct. Yeah, there hasn't been any learnings that have been adjusted and so forth. Now, you mentioned the importance of culture within an organization. So there's 2 points that I wanted to ask you. Do you think organizations just take it as default? And number two is you also mentioned in the book about, having different layers or different subcultures within an organization culture. How do you think that adds complexity to the environment of insider risk?
Yeah. I would say organizations, I think they're getting better at it, but often don't actually understand what their culture really is.
Yeah.
So, like, we sort of, yeah, like you say, take it for granted that like this is the culture.
Correct.
You come in, you normalize what's done in there, and don't necessarily think that culture is something that you can play an active role in shaping. I think that is changing. I think organizations more and more are recognizing that culture is something that they need to shape in order to get the best out of the assets and people that they have. And so more investment is being put into that. I always take the quote of Peter Drucker about culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yeah, I know, Peter.
And I think that's more and more about the way that organizations are thinking. I think from that perspective, then getting to your point about subcultures is recognizing like what are the things that are shaping the culture at a whole of organization level might be different depending, it's particularly on size and distribution and things
Correct.
like that of organizations, that different kinds of cultures are going to form, and you need to understand whether those things are more or less exposed. So I use the examples of, like, say for example, you've got parts of the regulatory system where you're working much more closely with industry, for example, than you might be with head office. So people work in state offices, they work very closely with people that they are regulating. So naturally their culture is going to be more closely aligned to the people that they tend to interact with the most.
Correct.
So you need to understand that whatever you're doing at the center might not necessarily have the same effect in those things unless you're really putting that extra mile into understanding it and doing something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. What do you think is the biggest misconception organizations have about insider threat? And then secondly, how does your book address this sort of misunderstanding? If there's,
I think it couldn't happen here. I think that's probably the one that I've seen the most. It's like the places where you've still got vulnerabilities and there's like a sort of a lack of belief really that it's a possibility until it occurs. And then suddenly everyone's reacting to the issue that's now occurred. But prior to that, there's a bit less of an understanding of the possibility of it, even though the risk exposures are there. And most likely it's also that they don't have the systems of detection in place, and that's why they haven't seen anything before, is because
correct.
So they haven't put anything in place to find out whether it is or isn't.
It's a bit of the chicken and the egg. If you don't know what you have, then you never know that you have something.
Yep.
Which then leads me to the following question: is why do you think senior governance bodies do not consider insider threat practices as a core component of their business strategies?
It's probably also for the same reason, right? If you're not exposed to it as being a part of the critical risk to the organisation, and you don't have mechanisms to find out whether it is an issue or not, then boards naturally are thinking we've got other things to think about.
Correct.
And so they're not necessarily investing in those. And it's the same across a whole range of different regulatory spheres, I think, or risk management spheres, where until you start really looking, that's when you're going to find that actually there's more exposure, and that exposure to your business objectives may actually be higher than other things that you're currently focusing on. I also think it's, and again, I touch on this a bit in the final chapter, is having someone who has responsibility and accountability for the system is a really critical component, because then they have someone who is, who's charged with looking at it and understanding what the size of the problem is. And if no one exists to do that, and it doesn't have to be someone separate, it could be the CRO or it could be whoever, but someone charged with that role is going to then try and understand the exposure that the organisation has and provide better advice to the board than if you don't have anyone that has a role of that calibre.
Yeah, very much so. So you've had over 10 years across various government departments and so forth. How have Inside Australia evolved during that period? And what emerging trends are you seeing or being aware of?
I would say there's probably a range of different things. I think the way that we do business has obviously evolved very quickly with automation, and yeah, automation and the way that we now kind of deploy our business into the world, I suppose. Like we've obviously got much more involvement of ICT people in our business structures, and they're not a place to ignore, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I talk about this a bit, but like information, code is kind of, it's both business instruction, if you want, when we're talking about like code for automation, it's both a business process, it's information about how your business works. And it's kind of, commercial type information as well. So it has multiple different lines of exposure that might not have existed previously if you were just, doing like manual business. And obviously the more that we automate, the more we go into that space. I think, there's a huge conversation about AI everywhere across.
I was going to ask you that question. Yes. Yeah.
AI, I personally don't like the word intelligence in AI because I don't really think it is. It's nothing like our intelligence anyway. It's really, you wouldn't teach your child how to make a judgment purely on statistics, but effectively AI is extremely advanced statistics. And look, it's great stuff. Like I've, again, worked in the data space, done machine learning things in a regulatory space. It is a massive advance. So don't think that I'm saying it's not. But I think it's another actor in the system now. And it's an actor that we have to be really understanding how to, again, put the same kind of quality assurances and controls around what it's able to do on its judgments, and make sure that those things are not also as if they were a person inadvertently doing the wrong thing. They're just a person that can inadvertently do the wrong thing extremely fast. They can be exactly more efficient at doing the wrong thing if they're not doing the right thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we need to think about that, and again, think of those AI parts of the process and those decisions, again, a very systematic way, and understand how to make sure that the right kind of, again, statistical controls for opportunity, if you want to call it that, are in place in those sorts of systems as well.
If you're looking into the future, let's say 3 or 5 years from today, where do you think insider threats and the management of it is going to be roughly?
Well, I hope that that some of these systemic elements are something that does come to define a bit better how we do things. I hope more broadly, I think the field of business architecture is something that also is kind of growing, and in some ways this is kind of using business architecture to describe insider risk, right? I think that, and the use of, like, the understanding of organizations in a structured data way as well, I think hopefully will evolve. I think there's no question that AI is also something that is growing in ways that we've kind of yet to fully see and realize just where that's going. But I think also at the same time, there is more thinking now about how to understand the risks in that space and to manage them. So I think that can only be positive. And I also think, like, one of the other elements here is really, you could look at it in a negative way, the insider risk thing. But I think also the other part of managing things in a systemic way is understanding the downside impacts of control. So
I mean, you mentioned it quite a bit in the book. So and I'm very glad, because not many organizations really think about it. They tend to think more around usability versus control, but not so much the impact.
And I think that the thing there, if we think about the future, is we don't want insider risk management to become a hamper on innovation either. So
No, correct.
it's being able to make informed decisions about what we control, what we allow to run its course, how we allow innovation to emerge, and when we decide that it's exceeded our appetite. All of that sort of thing, I think, is something that hopefully in these kinds of that maturing of organizational design will get embedded a bit more. The other thing that I've been thinking about, and you would have seen in the final chapter, is it sort of sets out a broad data model for how the systemic approach kind of fits together. I'm hoping at some point to have the time to work with people to turn that into an actual data model that can be used at an organizational level as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what do you hope readers of this book will take away?
Well, I hope that they take away like that core premise of that insider risk is it is a genuine threat to organizations, not just to a part of the organization or a small issue that's to the side, but actually that it's something that contributes to risk at the whole of organization and objective level. That having a systemic way of looking at those risks and deploying controls is a better way of investing finite resources into the organization. And that it's really also about protecting your people and assets rather than putting a hamper on the way that you do business. And deploying that in a nuanced way allows you to do both things. They're not exclusive. You can do both. Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah. So look, we come to the end of this discussion. Let me ask you this question. Is there something I should have asked you, but I haven't? Is there something that you'd like to elaborate more about the book that maybe the viewers will find it interesting? Or
I think we didn't really touch very much on the beneficiaries element of the book as well.
No, we didn't.
I think that the other really interesting thing to think about in an insider threat context is the link with the outside world and the people that might be targeting your people. I think about it in a regulatory context a lot, and one of them is this concept of tactical displacement. So when we're thinking about external controls, if we strengthen those external controls and someone still has the intention to be able to get around them and they can no longer get around them from the outside. So if we think of, in places that I've worked, border control, if you can misdeclare something and get it into the country, then you don't need an insider, right? As soon as we get better at that external control, detecting what's not there, well then if they still want to get things through, then they've got to target someone internally to try and get around it. So when we're strengthening the outside controls, we need to at the same time think, is that going to shift the risk into the inside? And that's when we again need to be thinking about how do we protect our people in that.
I totally agree. I think these are saying that if the door is locked, there's no point in beating the dog. Find someone that can actually open the door. So there's more and more, from what I'm seeing, like recruiting, like social media recruiting for people in certain positions. It's always, easy to find someone. The question is, would someone be prepared to divulge secrets if they got paid some sum of money? And what is that sum of money? So we're humans, so it's much easier to look at people than looking at controls, especially if you've got good, perimeter controls or whatever. No, totally agree.
Yeah. So, and I guess the message there is really when you're thinking about strengthening other risk controls, you need to be thinking about what does that do to your insider threat? Does it change the character of it? And it's worth thinking about those two things together.
I totally agree. How do viewers get hold of this book? What's the best process for them to get hold of this book?
Well, it is available online. So it's Routledge, who's the publisher, on their website. You can write Routledge and my name, and it comes up in search.
Okay.
It is also available on Amazon, similar way, either title or looking up my name will come, or Insider Threat and my name will come up with it.
Excellent, excellent. And look, if someone wants to reach out to you, Pierre, is there a way for them to do that?
Yep. I'm on LinkedIn and happy to have a conversation. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn because I don't think there's very many Pierre Skoriches out there.
Well, Pierre, look, it's been a pleasure having you on. Again, I very much enjoyed reading the book, and I also very much enjoyed talking to you about the book. Thank you, and yeah, it's a pleasure. Great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone, and see you next time.